Now in this video lecture, we are going to take a look at Richard Wolff's argument for worker cooperatives and discuss the idea of democracy in the workplace. So first, we have to distinguish between two different kinds of capitalist enterprises. The first is private and the other is state. Now, I know this might sound odd because we might think there's no way you can have a capitalist enterprise that is state run, but in a moment, I'll explain how that can and is the case. First, though, with what you're probably more familiar with, modern private capitalist corporations. So this is where persons, and it's almost never workers, right, but just the owners, which could be workers, but it's almost never, collectively appropriate and distribute the surplus, the profit, right, that is generated inside the corporation, deciding what commodities to produce, how to produce them, what technology to use, where to locate the production and distribution facilities, and who should be hired and what positions those people will have. So all of those issues are decided by the owners, which is almost never workers. Now, state capitalist enterprises actually run the same way. You still have a fundamental antagonism between the owner who decides all of these things, how the company is going to be run, what's going to be produced, who's going to work what position, how much people are going to make, and then you have the workers that just have to do it. State capitalist enterprises run the exact same way, except the board of directors is typically a set of state officials. So instead of having private individuals make all those decisions, you just have government officials that make those decisions, and they also are not workers. So that means the fundamental antagonism between owner and worker still remains in place, even though it's an antagonism in this case between we could say government owners, so to speak, and private workers, or well, government workers in this case. But there are also forms of decentralized state capitalist enterprises, where of course a centralized state capitalist enterprise would be run by, we could say state board of directors that would determine what production happens and so on across, let's say, a whole country, as opposed to maybe it would be like each state or each locality would have a government board that would decide for it, and in that way it could be more decentralized. But the crucial point is you have the workers that just have to do whatever the board of directors decides they're going to do, and whatever the surplus they produce, that is determined, what's done with that is determined by the board of directors. Now, there are different kinds of worker-involved enterprises. Firstly, there are worker-owned enterprises. So oftentimes you can find businesses that, advertise they are worker cooperatives that, let's say like Publix, for example. You go to work at Publix and you are actually issued a share of Publix, the company Publix. Well, this means you own part of Publix. But here's the difference. With worker-owned enterprises, they still do not do what board of directors do. They have no say in, again, what are they going to produce? How much are they going to sell it for? Who's going to work what positions? How much are they going to make? What are they going to do with the profits? And so on. All it says is that they just have a financial stake in the company. That's it. Worker-managed enterprises, these are where managers in a company are more closely understood to be workers, and they have a greater say over what is produced, but they don't own, they don't own the company outright like one could in a worker-owned enterprise. Finally, just cooperatives in general don't indicate that business is democratically run, because you can have cases where an enterprise or land is owned, but that doesn't mean that the organization or production or class structure of the enterprise is determined democratically by all involved. So There is one difference, though, one that goes beyond those, and that is a workers' self-directed enterprise. This is where workers collectively own, but they also operate the enterprise. So these workers are involved in the board of directors processes. They collectively, democratically determine what are, as you know, is the company going to produce, who's going to make what, how much is everyone going to make, what are they going to do with the profits, and so on. That's all democratically decided by the workers. So two facts we can say then define worker self-directed enterprises, or WSDEs. One, that the appropriation and distribution of the surplus are done cooperatively. So it's done in a matter where they all have a stake in it, and they all share in the labor burden. And two, that the workers who cooperatively produce the surplus and those who cooperatively appropriate and distribute it are identical. That there is no essential distinction between, let's say, the board of directors and a lowly laborer, as is the case with a modern, private capitalist corporation. So quite literally, they bring democracy to the workplace. In this way, we can understand WSDEs, worker self-directed enterprises, as post-capitalist enterprises. One reason is they're free from exploitation. So as Richard Wolff says, WSDEs are, to make use of Marx's precise term, non-exploitative organizations or class structures of production, because they do not involve one group of people appropriating the surplus produced by another. That is how WSDEs differ from the exploitative class structures of capitalist, feudal, and slave production systems. So, of course, the previous epochs in human history, or previous systems of exploitation, first, you had that of the master-slave antagonism or dichotomy, where you had an entire class that were masters that did not work, that had another class of slaves that were owned by individuals and had to work as the individual determined. Now, this system was eventually overthrown in favor of the feudal system. In the case of the feudal system, serfs did not work for an individual lord. Instead, they were enslaved to the land. It was a matter of their status that was determined by an entire social order that tied them to the land. So in a sense, their enslavement became more abstract because they couldn't, point to any individual that owned them, but instead they could point to a status system that tied them to the land. Now, with capitalism, the lower class becomes more free because they're no longer bound to land. They are free actually to become, what we could have considered lords before, now capitalists, but they are, as workers, enslaved to a class, which means it becomes even more abstract, the system of exploitation, because again, they're not tied to one single owner, they're not tied to the land, but they're tied to a class, which is basically an entire group of people, and it really doesn't matter the individuals in that class, the upper class or the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, that the proletariat or workers are tied to. Those people are interchangeable. What matters is the dynamic between them, the antagonistic relationship between them, such that they have no other choice but to starve or work for a capitalist or become a capitalist. And of course, it's impossible for all of them actually to become capitalists, because capitalism, for there to be a capitalist class, depends on workers to perform labor on the capital owned by the capitalists to produce surplus value or profits. So in this way, worker self-directed enterprises, WSDEs, are a kind of post-capitalist enterprise, because since workers collectively own and determine the means of production, they have effectively collapsed the class distinction between owner and worker, because now the workers are both owners and workers. So some of the key goals and functions of worker self-directed enterprises is they need to secure the reproduction of the enterprise, right? So they need to ensure that they have a stable, let's say, a stable consuming class of people that They have, an ability to get the resources they need to make the products that consumers are going to buy, and so on, right? So this is all the same things that, a modern capitalist, private capitalist corporation requires. But oftentimes a WSDE needs a bit more social support than is needed with, an MPCC, modern private capitalist corporation, because oftentimes the profit given towards a corporation to ensure that they can save as much money and sell a product for as cheap as possible, it's not as easy for WSDE to do, because since the workers are not exploited like they are in an MPCC, there's less profit to be made to be used to root out competition. And this is at the base of capitalist market competition. It is this fundamental antagonism between all other businesses, that it is ultimately, if you do not continually reduce your costs and increase your profits, you are at risk of going out of business. So WSDEs typically require a bit more social support from a community or government. Additionally, another key goal and function is to secure management function. So they need to have some kind of system where workers can be promoted into management, or return back to a previous position, or be promoted to a higher level, or so on, in such a way that it's democratically determined and determined on merit. And finally, of course, there's a desire to avoid economic crises and is slipping back into a capitalist system, where you don't want a group of workers, of course, to, for whatever reason, take hold of the enterprise and break the democracy, so to speak, that runs the enterprise. Now, there are two kinds of workers in every WSDE. One, you have the workers who produce surpluses and who also compose the board of directors in the WSDEs. These are the people who directly produce goods. So it could be software programs, shirts, buses, machines, whatever it is that the company makes. The second kind of group of employees in a WSDE is the workers who provide the conditions and ancillary services that enable the surplus producers to function, right? So they facilitate, or they enable the production of the goods which the business sells. So these could be things like secretaries, clerks, receptionists, security guards, cleaning staff, and so on. So what WSDEs have to do is work out mutually acceptable relationships between the two kinds of workers. They have to, together, collectively, democratically answer these two questions. First, how much surplus will be produced, appropriated, and available for distribution? So how much of the profits are they going to use for what? And how much of that is going to be used for a return on wages? Maybe how much of that is going to be used to maybe make it so you only have to work 4 days a week instead of 5 days a week? Secondly, what portions of that surplus will be distributed to secure conditions of surplus production provided by which distinct subgroup of enablers? So what amount of the profit made will be distributed to the workers and the salaries they make? Is it going to be that no one is going to make, let's say, 3 times more than the lowest paid employee, or 10 times more, or everyone, is going to make it based on some kind of performance analytics or otherwise, right? That all has to be democratically decided by the workers themselves. So one thing that WSDEs are better at than MPCCs is handling technical changes. So they handle technical and economic challenges differently and better than MPCCs, because the decision to install a new technology is democratically determined. And this could mean, instead of a whole group of people in an enterprise losing their job because now this technology has made a previous position redundant or unnecessary, they could say, hey, we're going to install this technology, but only because we, which are part of the group of people that our jobs are going to get taken away, and we get to decide on what we're going to do with this technology, we want to, work in another part of the company, or we want to do something that might be related to the technology, but that's a different position, right? This is a way in which you can prevent problems like outsourcing and job loss, because it is in the workers' collective interest to decide these things together and not just boot out an entire group of workers. Because again, it's there's something in democracy, right, where you are less susceptible to an entire group of people being booted out, as opposed to in the case of the typical hierarchically binding structure, we should say, of an NPCC, where you just have an owner that makes the decision and the workers just have to live with it, right? The owner has no real ties to the decisions in technical and economic changes that are made like workers do. WSDEs are also better at handling environmental issues. So think about stakeholder theory. Workers are going to be affected by certain, let's say, environmental pollutions that might be a result of the enterprise. Because of that, you have the fact that the community as a stakeholder in the business is also going to be one and the same as the workers as stakeholders in the business. And they are going to be therefore less likely to do things that are going to be environmentally damaging. So environmental pollution typically is rooted in the small number of people directing private and state capitalist enterprises, who are often located far from the site of enterprise production. So, right, with WSDEs, workers live, they play, they raise families in and around their sites of work. So their decision-making is entirely different, and it's typically much more environmentally friendly. So as mentioned before, a WSDE system is likely to mandate minimum and maximum income levels for all workers, but remember, it's going to be based on democratically chosen criteria, which could potentially have jobs rotated. Some of the benefits of this are the broad range of experience, which would best prepare workers to evaluate options and make decisions involved in directing an enterprise. Because the business would be democratically owned and ran, there's more likely the case that workers learn more about the business. They get to work in more roles in the enterprise, giving them better knowledge of how the business runs. Because oftentimes it's the case that an owner actually doesn't understand what is best for a specific role or job in the company. It is only those who actually use, let's say, the tools that best understand what it is that could improve the efficiency, let's say, of the tools. So a particular learning by doing in practice can develop. And specific jobs can also change with technical and social conditions, which, again, a WSDE is better prepared to deal with than a modern private capitalist corporation. As Richard Wolff says, beyond a certain degree and a certain period of time, keeping one person in one job may reduce the productivity and profitability. If a fully rounded personality and a diversely engaged body and mind are connected to personal happiness, genuine democracy, and work productivity, then a WSDE-based economic system with rotation of jobs will be far more fulfilling and quite possibly more productive than work has been under private or state capitalism. And the reason is, right, to go back to the 4 kinds of alienation, if workers collectively own and run the enterprise, they're not alienated or estranged from the goods they produce. They get to determine what they produce and what is done with the profits from the goods that are produced. They are not estranged from the work themselves because they get to collectively determine how much they make or what they're going to make. They are not estranged from each other because they see each other as equals, as almost citizens, as opposed to potential competitors where one can take the job away from another. And they're not estranged or alienated from their species being because there is a better likelihood, since they have this much control over their working life, that they are able to have a sense of fulfillment and pride in what it is that they do. So some examples of WSDEs are the Mondragon Corporation. This is the world's largest WSDE. It's located in Spain. It employs over 80,000 people. It has 257 companies and organizations in 4 areas of activity: finance, industry, retail, and knowledge. We have the Morning Star Company, a California-based agribusiness and food processing company. The Orpheus Chamber Orchestra, a classic music chamber orchestra based in New York City, where musicians, not a conductor, interpret the score. And another example, and there are far more examples than just these 4, the W.L. Gore and Associates Company, which is an American manufacturing company specializing in products derived from fluoropolymers, which created a waterproof, breathable fabric. So, one question we need to consider now in light of this: to what extent do you think workers' self-directed enterprises solve the exploitation and alienation in work, and whether or not it makes business more ethical, if that's even possible at all?